All right, everybody, we'd like to invite you to take your seats again. And we have... It's hard to imagine, but we've already been going for 3 hours this morning. And I'm not sure where those 3 hours have disappeared to. But I'd like to invite you to take your seats. Our final presentation this morning is from Dr. Gane. And his presentation is up on the Daniel 11 website. So I invite you to download it from there. And just a reminder, we've been mentioning repeatedly, particularly of the last two conferences and already last night, that we realize that there are areas of common understanding between some of these, the Islam, the atheism, and in particular viewpoints. So if you realize that there's an area of common understanding, or you think that there is, we have Dr. Perry Loudon sitting on the back there from Tennessee. We asked him this morning just to keep a running record of what we think are the areas of agreement. Not so much, we always focus on that which divides us, but he's keeping record of that where we have some common agreement. So if you have a comment like that, don't sit on it, but raise your voice and share it, because we want to capture those things, not just the areas that divide us in our interpretation. So Dr. Gane, let's have a prayer, and then we'll hand over to you. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the ministry of Dr. Gane. Lord, we thank you how both he and his wife are gifted as teachers, gifted with knowledge and wisdom. And I pray today, Father, that you speak through Dr. Gane. Lord, he's going to cover some difficult material, and I ask that the spirit of wisdom will fall upon him, that what he says will build up the body of Christ. Father, give us ears to hear, give us the gift of discernment, that we may perceive how you are leading us. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
I would like to dedicate this presentation to the person who got me interested in Daniel 11 53 years ago, 1968, when I was 13 years old. We were on vacation, and my father was teaching a Daniel class at Union College, and he was very interested in Daniel 11. It's the part of Daniel that he really hadn't gotten into because nobody really had. People just weren't equipped to deal with it. It's too complex. And he had Uriah Smith with him, and he was reading through his Bible in NRSV. He was a trained historian. He got a PhD from the University of Nebraska in Renaissance Reformation church history. So he was trained in historical methodology, and he was also trained here at the seminary. He got several degrees, including he studied some biblical languages. So he was reading through Daniel 11, comparing it with Uriah Smith. And I remember his comments. I won't repeat those to you, but he got me interested in Daniel 11 from that point. And I have discovered, as when I had to teach Daniel at the undergraduate level, I believe at PUC, and then certainly for years and years I've taught here at the seminary. Been at the seminary for 27 years. I've been teaching Daniel. And particularly here, when I had to put material together for my students, I kept my father's ideas in mind and tested them exegetically because I'm trained in the biblical languages. He was more into history and other things. I'm more into biblical languages. But as I've tested his ideas, I've come to basic confirmation of what he initially came up with. That is, 53 years ago. So this is not really a new idea. Some people think this is really, really new. It's not as new as they think it is. It's been around for a while. And I'd like to dedicate it to my father because he died several weeks ago, September 26th. And so here we go. Raw data and its implications in real exegesis of Daniel 11. By the time we're done here, you're going to call me Raw Gane. All right. Exegesis. Meaning out of a text. The Greek preposition ex means out. So that is getting the meaning out of the text, what is in it. Rather than eisegesis is reading into the text what the interpreter wants to see or wishes to see in the text, which could be constraints on what they allow the text to mean. You know, a lot of times people put boxes around it, and the text is not allowed to say that because the interpreter doesn't want to see that possible meaning. I've seen that happen a lot. What we need to do is to know, but bracket out our biases affecting our interpretation. That's the role of an exegete. We have to bracket out our biases. Now, this is difficult. In fact, it's like sanctification. It's the work of a lifetime. But we have to realize that we have to do that because we have to listen to the text even when it is something that we don't like. When we don't necessarily agree with it, we have to accept that that was the meaning that the author intended. Okay? We have to begin with raw data, which is not subject to interpretation. Exegesis works from the known and it goes to the unknown. I heard my teacher, one of my teachers at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Avi Horvitz, made that very clear. In interpretation of texts, you begin with the known and you work to the unknown. And that way, in other words, you don't interpret something that's known by something that you don't know. Okay? You work from the known to the unknown. And you penetrate as far as you can with what is solid, and what's not solid, you have to say, well, we're not quite sure about that, right? But certain things you can be sure about. And what I'm trying to do in this paper here is to identify facts, raw data that is not subject to interpretation. And that has a huge impact on the way we're going to view Daniel 11. We build then on the implications of the raw data within context. Okay, so there's the raw data, and then how do we move beyond it? That moves into the area of interpretation. But as we do that, we have to take the context of the text into account, the context that is especially shaped and so on, identified by that raw data. So this whole presentation is basically a case study or several case studies in this hermeneutic, this methodology, which should go without saying. We shouldn't have to say that this is what exegesis is. But there's a lot of what goes by the name of exegesis that's not really exegesis, that is not doing this, and it's people reading into, but using exegetical tools, but yet shaping things and ignoring data and twisting data and prioritizing data to make it fit the preconceived notion of the interpreter, or else not allowing it to say what the text says that it says. That, I believe, is pseudo-exegesis, that is false exegesis, that looks like exegesis, and people who really don't know the discipline of exegesis fall for it. They don't know the difference, okay? So it's deceptive. Now, it's not necessarily dishonestly deceptive. A lot of times it's just because the people doing it don't know the discipline of exegesis, of bracketing out their presuppositions. And so they're shaping it in a way without really knowing the tools of exegesis adequately or the discipline of being as objective as we can. None of us are completely objective, except God. He knows everything. He's objective. All of us. But we have to recognize that danger of subjectivity and counter that as we go. Various kinds of raw data in Daniel. First is the literary unit and the genre we're going to look at. Intratextuality. That's going to overlap a little bit with what Dr. Yonker did. Match between text and historical events. And so now we're going to begin with literary unit and genre. There's a narrative introduction in Daniel 10, everybody agrees. And in 10 verse 1, it says a word that is not a vision, it's a davar in Hebrew, concerning a previous vision. All right? So it's introducing this revelation that goes from chapter 10 to chapter 12, introduced in chapter 10 as a word, a davar. It doesn't call it a hazon or even a mar'eh, which is a word for vision. It is a word. So it is spoken communication. In Daniel 10:14, it says that it's explanation of the previous vision in Daniel 8. That's very clear. And then in 11:2b to 12:3, we have the content of revelation in a single speech unit. Now the speech begins earlier, at the end of chapter 10, at about verse 20 or so, and it continues. But the revelation begins starting with 11:2b, the second half of verse 2. And then it continues all the way through 12:3, and then the angel gives, or the heavenly being gives Daniel a command to seal it up, shut it up. Okay, so that's a different kind of speech. That's not revelation of the future, that's a command to Daniel. So the basic speech unit of revelation of the future introduced comprises these verses. That is raw data, okay? That's raw data. Nobody can argue with that, all right? Daniel 11 verse 2b, 3 more kings. That establishes basically literal genre at the beginning of the discourse unit. That again is raw data. When it says 3 more kings, more, od, is referring to in addition to the kings that we've had, which are the Medo-Persian kings. And those appear right in the very first verse of Daniel 10, referring to Cyrus, and then it refers to Darius the Mede at the end of chapter, in fact, in Daniel 11, verse 1, it refers to Darius the Mede. Okay. And then, so 3 more kings in addition to literal kings. Okay. And so this is a basically literal genre at the beginning of this unit. The implication is, then, that we need to read this as continuation of text that is basically literal through the rest of the chapter, unless the text indicates otherwise. Because when you have a unit of speech that begins in a certain genre, and it's a single unit of speech, if you have no markers that indicate, okay, now I'm going to explain to you, or Daniel sees a vision, and ra'ah, he uses the verb ra'ah, to see, and he sees a chazon or a mar'eh. Those would be indicators that we're going into symbolic now genre. Okay, in fact, that would not be within the same speech unit, would it? Because that would be a separate kind of discourse, a separate kind of language. So the implication is continuation unless the text indicates otherwise. So let's trace this and see how it works. Literal fulfillment in verses 2b to verse 4. Everybody agrees with this. Xerxes, well, not everybody agrees that it's Xerxes here, but king number 4, okay, after the 3 more kings, then the 4th will be far richer than them all. He'll stir up all against Greece, and the one who actually historically did that was Xerxes. Right, Connie? My wife is a Mesopotamian archaeologist, and this is agreed upon by everybody, at least my wife and I, that's what counts, right? But really, you read a lot of the scholars, and they agree with that. And then we have a mighty king will arise. That's Alexander the Great. And then it really refers to language that we've had in chapter 8, referring to the division into 4. That's the division of Alexander's empire into 4 parts, just as we have back in chapter 8. So none of this is really in dispute, that this is literal fulfillment. Daniel 11, verse 4, refers to the 4 winds of heaven. That is to say, Alexander's empire is split up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Oh, that's figurative. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's a symbolic vision. That's idiomatic, figurative language within the context of basically literal speech. Okay? We do that all the time when we speak. And this is what's occurring here in this interpretation. In fact, it's a figure of speech for 4 directions. Zechariah 6, 5, and 6 makes that clear. The preterists like to say, and people who argue against the Adventist position, including some preterists, so-called or former Adventists, like to say, well, horns, like the little horn, don't come out of winds. That's true. But when did you see a goat running across the land, a he-goat, running across so fast that it never touched the ground? When did you see a creature with 7 heads and 10 horns? We're not constrained by material constraints in the material world, okay? This is symbolic here. And so the idea that you would have the 4 winds of heaven there in Daniel 8, verse 9, that the little horn symbolically comes out of one of the 4 winds of heaven, means it comes out of one of the 4 directions of the compass, okay? But here, it's not embedded in a symbolic passage as it is there. It's embedded in a basically literal passage with an idiomatic meaning, and that's just fine. We use that in our kind of language all the time. We have a continuation of subjects, of verbs, and pronouns. This is called anaphora. We're going to hear Dr. Tarsi Lee on the topic of anaphora. A very fine paper. I've heard his material. And this is showing literal address in verses 4 through 19. In other words, it's continuing literal address, referring to he, him. Just anaphora is words like pronouns, he, him, his, right, that refer to nouns that are identified, and also subjects of verbs, like third masculine singular subjects of verbs that are included in the Hebrew verbs because they're inflected. Okay, so these things are indicating a continuity of these different rulers going all the way from 4 through at least 19. We do have literal fulfillment in verses 5 and 19, conflict between 2 divisions of Alexander's empire, going all the way up to verse 19, where the preterists, I believe, are correct, where they're seeing he shall return to his land and he shall stumble and fall, is referring to the death of Antiochus III. So Antiochus III goes from verse 10, he and his brother are fighting there, starting in verse 10, going all the way through verse 19, where he dies. And that's the end of the Seleucid period, that's the end of the Greek period. And then there shall arise in his place, Al-Kano, verse 20, would be a major transition to another power. Now, of course, the preterists like to say, well, that was the son, I think it's Seleucus IV, the son of Antiochus III, and then the next one, the despicable one, is Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Adventist interpreters haven't wanted to get that close to Antiochus Epiphanes, so they've tried to bail out of the Greeks back in verse 14 or verse 16, but none of that works, as I'm going to show you even more. It continues up to verse 19, which raises a question. Why so much of Daniel 11 concerns this one king, Antiochus III, the Great? He was the most important of the Greek kings of the north. But I suspect that there is a reason, in terms of analogy, because his career, his trajectory, is a great forerunner of that of the papacy. He takes over the glorious land in verse 16, which is the land of Israel. That's what the papacy wants to do. And so we have this kind of climaxing of Antiochus III, and then we drop down, and then we have the trajectory of Rome climaxing later in the chapter, paralleling the career of Antiochus III. So I think that there's a literary reason for that, a prophetic literary reason. Conflict between two contiguous divisions of the empire. It's explicitly named as Egypt in verse 11. No, verse 8 of chapter 11. 11 verse 8 refers to Egypt as the king of the south. The only other contiguous, that is next to it, part of the four divisions, okay, because the others were all to the north, but the only one next to it that would fight against it, in fact, over the land of Israel, was the Seleucid Syrian Empire. Okay, the southern kingdom is Egypt. I just said that. The land of Israel is between the two, and this is why it's so significant, because the people of God are caught in the middle, in between. And this is what happens later in the chapter. We have the later king of the north and king of the south, and what happens to the people of God. All right, so there's a highly accurate literal prediction in verses up through verse 19. It's so accurate that many scholars, preterist scholars, followed Porphyry back in the 234 to 305. He was an anti-Christian. He was a pagan who was anti-Christian. He wrote a book or pamphlet, whatever it was, a treatise called Against Christianity. And he was trying to show that the book of Daniel is wrong. I'm sure because Daniel 9:24 to 27 shows us who the Messiah is, right? So he tries to say it all happened back there in the time of Antiochus. And that was picked up, especially in the Counter-Reformation. The Reformers knew who the Antichrist was, okay? But the Counter-Reformation then picks it up, the idea of Porphyry. No, it's back in the past. And then another Jesuit, one Jesuit went that direction, another Jesuit went the direction of, no, it's in the future. So that was futurism. And futurism has taken over, it's a pop theology. It's not really in the scholarly commentaries, but it's many people believe it, Left Behind and that kind of thing. And so it's out there. But these two ideas were Counter-Reformation ideas. Where did the bad guy go? The Reformers knew right here. Where did the bad guy go according to the Counter-Reformation? That away. Simultaneously, mutually exclusive. It doesn't matter, anywhere but here. Okay? All right. So it's so accurate that many scholars say this is ex eventu. Vaticinium ex eventu in Latin. That's the term that's used. And that is prophecy after the fact. Meaning, it's history. Someone was living in the 2nd century after this time, like just after the career of Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was writing this because he knew what had happened, because he's living after the fact, but he's presenting it as if it's prophecy. And then he's speculating, and where it deviates from the career of Antiochus after that, that's where he's wrong, and that's where it's real prophecy. That's the reasoning of the preterists, you see? Now, there's one major problem with that is developing among scholars in the Second Temple literature, and that is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the manuscripts, the hard copy manuscripts, are dated so close to the date when Daniel is supposed to have been composed, and they're already canonical texts. And in fact, we have a significant textual development, including into Theodotion and the Dead Sea Scrolls and everything, but within too short an amount of time, that the text of Daniel could not have been written in the 2nd century. Okay, so that's another whole issue. All right, Daniel 11, verse 20, then shall arise in his place. This is a new protagonist, a new actor coming on the stage. Continuing literal speech, referring to the previous king of the north. Then shall arise in his place. Okay, so we have the continuation of this anaphora referring to his, him, with a chain of unbroken pronouns all the way through. 11:21, again, in his place, continuing literal speech, predicting a despicable one, that he and his goes all the way now through verse 32. So the preterists say this is Antiochus Epiphanes, but as I'll show, it doesn't work that way. But what does work is that there's a continuation. The actor, in some sense, continues, and it's all literal. You can't say at any point that, you have his referring to, okay, this is a symbol, his referring to a literal. No, it doesn't work that way. Language doesn't work that way. But then we have a little interlude. In Daniel 11, 33 to 34, we have a focus on God's faithful people as victims of the despicable one. And then in verse 36, we have the king resuming focus on the despicable one through verse 39. Now, there's been a big question about this king, Hamelech, at the beginning of 1136. And Uriah Smith thought that this is introducing another power. But the reason why you have Hamelech here is because the previous verses shifted the focus away from the Melech to his victims, the people of God that he's persecuting. Now, he's still in view there, but he's behind the scenes a bit, and they're in the foreground. And then to bring him back into the foreground, it's necessary to reintroduce with Hamelech, referring to the foregoing guy who has the same character. And he's the one who's been there all along, persecuting these people. But that's the reason for this, is the resumption there. And it doesn't identify him in any other way. It doesn't say he's king of this or king of that or some sort of king. You just assume Ha-Melech, definite article, the king. Meaning, yeah, the king we know about, who's been in the proceeding. Then in 1140, we have the king of the south will lock horns with him. We're going to discuss this translation here. This refers to previous literal despicable king of the north. Notice, again, we have the pronoun. Will lock horns with him, referring to the him in the previous verses. This is not a new person here as the king of the north. This is referring to the same one who's been there all along. So we have this unbroken chain, and then the continuation of the literal despicable king of the north goes all the way through the end of the chapter, verse 45. So we've begun with literal genre. We've continued with reference, literal reference, okay? Yes, some figurative language. And there's a bit more bunching up of figurative language toward the end, which it doesn't mean that it's changed genre. It means that there is more intensification for dramatic effect. This use of language, he will yishta'er, he will rush upon him like a whirlwind. He will whirlwind upon him. We talk about, or storm out against him. We talk about storming an enemy position anyway in military language, right? That doesn't mean that it's not a real army. It means that we're describing it in a dramatic way. Okay, conclusion regarding the genre of Daniel 11. There's a chain of subjects and of verbs and pronouns through Daniel 11 showing a succession of literal rulers. Yeah, success too to some extent, but I meant succession. Therefore, the king of the south remains literal in relation to the literal king of the north. If the king of the north is literal, fighting against the king of the south can't be some symbolic or abstract entity. No, it's also literal, basically. So this whole unit is the third basically literal angelic explanation of a symbolic vision in Daniel 8, 3 to 14, following the explanations, first one at the end of chapter 8, second one in 9, 24 to 27. When you have an interpretation of a symbolic vision, the interpretation is in basically literal language. Otherwise, if you try to explain it in symbolic language, you're adding confusion on confusion. right? So it has to be basically literal. Now, Benny H. Reynolds III agrees with me, and I agree with him. We work totally independently, okay? And I'm grateful to the Yonkers for pointing this work out, an excellent book. This is his PhD dissertation, which he has published. And here I quote, "Descriptions used in ancient Jewish apocalypses are symbolic if they point beyond their basic plain sense meaning and require a visionary to seek interpretation. Revelations in which visionaries and heavenly beings carry on direct, explicit conversations," we could add, as in our passage in Daniel 11, "are not symbolic," period. Okay? And that's his book, Between Symbolism and Realism. He also says this regarding specifically Daniel 10 to 12. Daniel 10 to 12 does not use symbolic ciphers to describe earthly or heavenly realities. Instead, the text employs explicit, realistic terminology. Some of the language might be described as esoteric, but opaque language is significantly different from symbolic, metaphorical, or allegorical language. All right? And I think he nailed it. I think he's absolutely right on the genre. Now, the genre here is a subgenre of the genre apocalypse. The genre apocalypse can include various subgenres. You can have historical apocalypses, as in Daniel and Revelation, which point to the future, but they also are spatial. They reveal some spatial realities, like John goes up to heaven and sees what it's like, right? You can also have strictly spatial apocalypses, and in Samea 14, 1979, John J. Collins edited a very important volume there dealing with the genre apocalypse. There are different kinds of apocalypses. What we see in the book of Daniel is the symbolic subgenre in the first part of Daniel 8, ram and a he-goat representing kings of Media Persia and also Greece, right? And so we have there the symbolic subgenre of apocalyptic prophecy. But then here we have the basically literal interpretation subgenre, which we find also in Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, following the symbolic vision. Okay? So here we have questions regarding the genre of Daniel 11. All right, so these are things that some people might point out as challenges to the idea that this is basically literal. First of all, a unified reign of successive individuals in 11:21 all the way through 45. The despicable one initiates a unified succession of individual rulers filling the same position, but compare Jeremiah 25:11, which, by the way, Daniel was studying at the beginning of Daniel 9, right? He was studying the books, including this verse. "This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Now, extended literal use of king, not symbolic. Which king of Babylon reigned for 70 years? Nebuchadnezzar reigned the longest as a king of, we're talking about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is Nebuchadnezzar II, okay? He reigned for 40 years, followed by, what, Neriglissar, Amel-Marduk, Nabonidus, Belshazzar co-reigned with him. None of them ruled for 70 years, and yet he says, the king of Babylon, 70 years. He's clearly referring to the office of the king of Babylon, right? Now, in 11:24, this is another thing that might be taken to indicate symbolic language. The word is 8. Okay, so the king of the north is going to do certain things, va'ad 8, until an 8. The word 8 means time. Okay, so compare Daniel 7:25, where the Aramaic Idan, also translated time by a lot of translations, is a prophetic year, 360 literal years, according to Adventist interpretation, with which I agree. So, however, the same English translation doesn't mean the same original meaning. Just because you have the word time in English translation in one place and time in another place doesn't mean that they're both talking about the same usage of the word time. And the biggest example I can think of with the biggest mistake is Leviticus 26, where God is saying, if you don't obey me and I punish you, and then I'll go on and I'll punish you 7 times more. And he repeats this about 4 times. 7 times more. Oh, so what did William Miller do? 7 times. This is day for a year. Therefore, and a year in prophetic time prophecy means 360 years. Multiply 7 times 360, and he got 2,520 years, which you put in his time chart, and you can see it. In William Miller's time chart, you can see that online. You just Google William Miller's time chart, you can see it in the upper right with 2,520 years citing Leviticus 26, and it's completely wrong because the word time has nothing to do with temporal time, that is time on the clock. It's multiplication time. It's 7 times over. And so it's completely wrong. It has nothing to do with even time, let alone prophetic and symbolic time. Okay? Some people are trying to resurrect that. They want to resurrect the mistakes of our forebears rather than see the corrections that we've had along the way. William Miller was a great man and started our movement, but he made some mistakes, and we have to admit them. The Hebrew equivalent of Edan, the Aramaic Edan, in Daniel 7 is Moed in 12:7. It's not 8. Okay? So when you have 3.5 times, like Edan, Edanin, Uplag Edan in Aramaic, 3.5 times, Moed, Moedin, you have the word Moed in Hebrew. It's not the word 8 that appears in Daniel 11:24. If 8 in the prophecy of Daniel must represent 360 years, it doesn't work in other instances of the word 8 in Daniel. And we could, for example, even within the lifetime of one royal woman in Daniel 11. This is all in my paper, okay? You can see the details. It has etim, for etim. Oh, if 8 is 360 years, multiplied by at least 2, because that's a plural, right? You get 720 years within the lifetime of one princess? No, doesn't work. Okay, so we have to throw that out. 8 does not have the day for year relationship. It's simply an unspecified limited time, as the commentators, including Zdravko Stefanovic, have recognized. Okay, archaic terminology. I won't belabor this because Dr. Yonker pointed this out. Archaism is not symbol referring to something more abstract that needs to be explained. That is what a symbol is. It's something more concrete that refers to something more abstract. Archaism doesn't do that. It's something old that refers to a newer equivalent. Okay? So it is not symbolism. Archaisms such as chariots and horsemen refer to later functional equivalents, but ships there is the same. Okay? Edom, Moab, all of these refer to later equivalents. Who lives in that territory in the Transjordan later? Okay, they're just archaisms. It's in a literal context because we have Egypt and Libya. Libyans, which is the same people that are there now by the same name. Okay, another one is Egypt. This is the territory of the king of the south at the end of Daniel 11. And there's been an attempt to link this, as I'll show you, with Revelation 11, verse 8, Egypt. But the king of the south at the end of Daniel 11 is no more just Egypt. Okay? It's broadened out. It's much bigger than just Egypt. The king of the south includes a lot more because it says countries, plural. The king of the north, when he comes in and attacks, he flows through countries, plural, of which Egypt is just one country. That's very explicit. Eretz Mitzrayim is just one country. It is not atheism, as in Revelation 11, verse 8, the great city, which is spiritually, and that tells you the genre right there. Spiritually, that's symbolically, allegorically, called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. That is a different subgenre of the genre apocalypse than what we have in Daniel 11. It does not apply. This is the proof text for many people that Daniel 11, Egypt at the end, the king of the south, is atheism. That is wrong. It's a spiritual usage here, and in fact it includes Sodom and Jerusalem, which we would also have to read into the end of Daniel 11, along with Egypt, because it's right there. It's all together referring to one entity, the great city, in Revelation 11. This is, hermeneutically, the error that arises when the meaning of a word, understood as the total series of relations in which it is used in literature, is read into a particular case as its sense and implication. This may be called illegitimate totality transfer. James Barr, The Semantics of Biblical Language. This is a favorite of many Christian, including Adventist scholars who are doing biblical theology a little bit detached from real exegesis. The reason why it's attractive is because our tradition is to gain our understanding from comparing Scripture with Scripture, right? This is not reading something into Scripture. This is reading something in from one part of Scripture to another. So that's supposed to be legitimate, right? What it is inner biblical eisegesis in the name of sola scriptura. Okay? We have sola scriptura. Oh yeah, sure, it's all within Scripture. Interpret this in light of that without fully taking the context into account. That is not rightly dividing the word of truth, as Paul would say. This is inner biblical eisegesis, which is why it's so popular, including it can be a favorite hermeneutical device of some interpreters, including some Adventist interpreters. And it is not real exegesis. News from the east and the north, these are literal geographic directions. South and north up to this point in Daniel has been literal. So why should it be different at this point? There's no clue that it should be. If these are directions from which Christ is about to come, they can be literal directions. Christ says he's going to come like lightning shining from the east to the west. Why can't those be literal directions that Christ comes? Just because it's Christ doesn't mean we have to spiritualize it. You know, Christ is going to come. We're going to see him as he is. If this is an antitype of Cyrus coming to conquer Babylon from the east and the north, as in these passages, this can be literal also. In fact, you have literal directions even in typological sanctuary rituals and the structure of the sanctuary. North means north, east means east, and so on. Okay? And that's all in my paper. Between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. The glorious land in Daniel 11 is the literal land of Israel. The holy mountain is Mount Zion, the Temple Mount in literal Jerusalem. There's other passages where we have that. It cannot be heavenly Mount Zion, as some have suggested, as in Revelation 14:1. In Revelation 14:1, the saints who are saved gather in the heavenly Mount Zion. They are now free from attack by Satan's forces, and they're in heaven. But that's not here in this context in Daniel 11, because it's before the deliverance, it's before Michael stands up, before the close of probation, and it's before the time of trouble, it's before the deliverance at the resurrection of Christ that is in verses 1 to 3 of Daniel 12. So this cannot be the heavenly Temple Mount. Here are some objections to the idea of the glorious holy mountain in Daniel 11:45 being the literal Temple Mount in Jerusalem. First, literal Israel has been superseded by spiritual Israel within the new covenant. Therefore, it could not be literal Israel. Unconditional apocalyptic genre. It's not classical prophecy with conditional eschatological role for literal Israel. And so there is a claim that if we are looking at this literally, that this is futurist dispensationalism that is akin to the Left Behind kind of approach. That's not true at all. Just because it could be literal Israel at the end of Daniel 11, for one thing, as Laurendale points out, but he doesn't follow through on his own implication, he says all of the covenant promises of God are for the people of God, which is the Christian church, the worldwide Christian church, and they have their fulfillment after the time of Christ. All the covenant promises, and that is absolutely true. We are absolutely, however, not talking about covenant promises here at the end of Daniel 11 in connection with literal Israel. This has nothing to do with covenant promises. It has to do with movements of earthly powers who have an interest in that, and their movements and what they do affect Christians all over the world. But it's not about fulfillment of covenant promises. It's about their greed and their wanting to have total domination over that land. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind. Answers to objections. First, the theology of a passage has to derive from exegesis of that passage. You can't read it in from somewhere else and say, it means that here, therefore it can mean this here, or it can't mean that here. We have to allow it to develop exegetically. Secondly, it's a conflict between earthly powers at the end of Daniel 11. This is not Armageddon. And Laurendale was arguing against the idea that this is all Armageddon. Of course it's not Armageddon. These are earthly powers. Armageddon in Revelation is a fight between forces of God and all the forces of Satan in the whole world. That's a different conflict. This is before Armageddon, before the close of probation. And then it is following that, Armageddon is going to come later. As I said, there's no covenant role or promises for Israel in Daniel 11. Literal Israel is important for the king of the north to have, and it's not for the people of God to have that land and he takes it from them. That's not the issue. That's not the issue. But what he is doing there symbolically in that place, not symbolically, but what he does there literally has the, let's say, symbolic ramification that he is signaling total domination. And then he can persecute God's people, and that's why it's important. Furthermore, as Dr. Yonker pointed out, he gave you the quotation, there is an eschatological role of literal Israel, literal Jerusalem in Zechariah 14:4, according to Ellen White's interpretation, where the Lord stands on the literal Mount of Olives, and it's split. And he takes over as the king of the north. Jesus takes over as the king of the north, takes over Jerusalem, stands there where the earthly king of the north, the rebel, wanted to stand, and Jesus is the victor at the end of the millennium. Okay, your people in Daniel 12, verse 1 is clearly Jewish. The covenant promises to the Israel of God were fulfilled during the Christian era, and they apply to the worldwide Christian church. Yes, with Larendale. However, I think Larendale went too far in applying that, not seeing that this is not about the covenant promises of God here in Daniel 11, nor is it about Armageddon. The New Testament reforms and refocuses Israel by its spiritual identity, which Old Testament Israel had in addition to its ethnic identity. That is heart circumcision. So there's continuity from the Old Testament usage. The New Testament Israel is not symbolic. All right? So it's grafting in of the people of God. It doesn't just have a supersession from a literal Israel to a symbolic Israel, because in the olden times, in the Old Testament, you had a lot of non-Israelites who could come and enter in and join that community, and now it just expands and becomes much broader. We have an organic continuity from literal Old Testament Israel, and I think Pastor LeBrun mentioned that, and we agree on that point. Okay. There's expansion of Daniel 11 to religious matters, but that doesn't make it symbolic, because you can talk about religious matters in literal terms. So it's not just spiritualizing. Religious things are described with basically literal language, and spiritual concern does not call for or justify a spiritualizing interpretation. All right, intertextuality. These last sections are going to go quicker. Intertextuality. Correspondences between identical Hebrew words or words with the same root in similar contexts in Daniel 8, 9, and 11 constitute raw data, as Dr. Yonker pointed out. And since he did some of these, I'll go faster here. Explanations of the correspondence goes beyond raw data into interpretation, but we should stay as close to the raw data as possible. And these correspondences help us to understand Daniel 11. Daniel 11 is complex and it's long, but the earlier ones give us a framework. And the language in similar places shows us when that language shows up, we see where we are in the progression of Daniel 11, provided that the language is appearing in a similar context. You can't just say this word here, therefore it has to be the same historical context as this in Daniel 11. No, it is if it's in the same context. The context is king in exegesis. Okay, Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, Medo-Persia, Alexander's empire, fourfold division. And then an anointed one, a prince, who will confirm a covenant associated with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, who they do this hishchit, which I think there is destruction rather than corruption. That's something we'll have to talk about. In any case, that's quite clear. And the fulfillment is Christ under imperial Rome. So that means that when you get to 1122, you have the Prince of the Covenant, the same term, also connected with destruction by the King of the North. That's really the same event. And this is really the crucifixion of Christ under imperial Rome. Daniel 8:25, deceit and destruction in the midst of peace by the papacy. Similar language in similar context in 11:23 to 24. This is the rise of the papacy. An alliance is made with the despicable one, that is imperial Rome. That's exactly what happened. The great apostasy, church-state alliance, already in 1123. And then 24 continues, he does deceit, becomes strong with a few people in the midst of peace. It could not be imperial Rome, which had many people. So this is the rise of papacy with a small people, but making an alliance with imperial Rome. 8 verse 11, the papacy removes that which is regular, Talmud, that is regular worship of God by his people, as the forces from the king of the north do in Daniel 11:31. The context of 11:31 continues the activity of the despicable king of the north. So this is not Clovis removing that which is regular here. It's just a continuation of the despicable one shown by the progression of anaphora, pronouns and subjects of verbs, and so on. Daniel 8:19 of the papacy, what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. 11:36, despicable king of the north will prosper till the indignation is accomplished. Same power, same language. Okay, match between language in Daniel 11 and historical events. He shall give him the daughter of women. Adventist interpreters from the time of Uriah Smith have said this is Cleopatra VII, because she's the most famous of all the Greek women, right? She's the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra, okay? There's a movie about Cleopatra. She was a Ptolemy from the south, but her father never gave her in marriage to anyone. Her father, Ptolemy the what? They're all named Ptolemy, right? I think he's Ptolemy the 12th or something like that. Auletes, I think he is. And he died when she was 18. He never gave her in marriage to anyone. That fact alone is raw data, and that fact alone rules out Cleopatra VII from being the daughter of women in 1117, with huge implications. Because the identification with Cleopatra VII was to be able to get Rome in there before this, because she fooled around with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, right? And so on. That's already the Roman period. But it doesn't work, because she's not that Cleopatra. That's just a mistake. Okay? It's not an alternative interpretation that's possible. It's just a mistake. Okay? There's no woman who does this that fits in the Roman period, because there's no separate king of the north, king of the south. Rome owned the south. And there's no giving in marriage of a king of the north in the Roman period to a king of the south, because it's all one unified empire. It could be, and this is what the preterists think, and I believe they're right, the only one that really seems to fit, that anyone has come up with, is Cleopatra I Syra, given by her father, Antiochus III, to Ptolemy V, which is in the south. Now notice that this is the north giving to the south, political marriage, exactly what happens there in Daniel 11:17. Cleopatra I fits the context. Now, Cleopatra VII doesn't. She was a Ptolemy from the south. See? She wasn't given in marriage at all, and she was from the south, so she wasn't given from the north to the south. The directions are off. Everything is off. But Cleopatra I fits the context given by her father. And in fact, according to the Christian porphyry, the anti-Christian porphyry that I told you about, after this marriage, by the way, Cleopatra I was about 11 years old when she was given in marriage to Ptolemy V, who's 16 years old. And this was a real marriage. They moved into the palace together, and they had children a little while later, okay? This we would call, child abuse. In any case, Cleopatra I, she was loyal to her husband rather than to her father, and porphyry says, therefore, he didn't gain an advantage from that. Now, this is what the rest of the verse says, that the king of the north doesn't gain an advantage. He wanted to use this political marriage to try to take over Egypt through his daughter. Didn't work, because she was loyal to her father. Okay, here's another one. A despicable person on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. Since Uriah Smith, it's been identified as Tiberius, he was not a usurper. That is raw data. Look it up anywhere. Wikipedia, it's public domain. He was named as the Roman emperor by September 17, 14 AD, after Augustus, his predecessor, the first emperor of Rome, died on August 19 of 14 AD, and Augustus had named him his adopted son and his stepson as his successor already, and then he was appointed officially by the Roman Senate that was in charge. He was not a usurper in any sense of the word. Therefore, he was not the despicable person, no matter how bad Uriah Smith tries to make him look. There were worse kings who were more despicable. Caligula, Nero, right? And yeah, Tiberius was really bad in a lot of ways toward the end of his life, but he was not a usurper. Therefore, that is a mistake. Neither is it Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was not a usurper either, although the preterists go to great gymnastics to try to make him a usurper. And furthermore, he didn't expand his empire as he's supposed to do in Daniel 8, verse 9. So that doesn't work either. Could be Julius Caesar, who did usurp the role of the Roman Senate over, which was ruling over the Roman Republic. Okay, so the Senate ruled the Roman Republic, and Julius Caesar usurped that power to take over sole rule, and he was instrumental in the transition to imperial Rome. And then his heir was Octavian, who became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. And his legacy goes all the way here from verse 21 all the way through to the end of the chapter. That's the same kind of imperial rule through imperial Rome and then the papacy, which is an extension, an organic extension of imperial Rome. It could be Julius Caesar. In which case, if this is verse 21, who is it in verse 20? The one who went and was appointed, he was sent to gain tribute and extend. This is Pompey. Pompey was appointed by the Roman Senate, by Republican Rome, to take over what they regarded as already theirs. He went and he made sure that they gathered tribute, and he was the oppressor who went out. That makes the best sense in verse 20, would be Pompey. Okay, so in 1120, before this is not Augustus, who reigned 40 years, one who shall send an exactor of tribute, but within a few days it shall be broken. A few days means years in Hebrew. But this couldn't be Augustus. He ruled for 40 years. So again, that Adventist interpretation is wrong. It was not Augustus. It could have been Pompey, but it could not be Augustus. Okay, 1140, the king of the south. This is the big one, all right? So we're going to climax here with the big one, and then I'll have my conclusion. The king of the south will engage him in battle. Engage him in battle translates the verb nagah. This is a unilateral thrust of a horn in the kal or the piel stem of the verb nagah. But it's not necessarily a mortal thrust, because we find, for example, in Exodus 21, the thrust of a literal bull doesn't necessarily kill a person, because the text has to say the mate, and they die. So that's not automatic. Furthermore, we find one of the prophets, a false prophet, says, with these you shall thrust and nagah him until he is destroyed. Okay, so nagah by itself doesn't bring destruction. Furthermore, in Ezekiel, it refers to nagah, again in the piel, saying that there's a nagah symbolically, metaphorically, that scatters the flock, scatters them. It doesn't say destroys them, scatters them. However, all that evidence about the kal and the piel is irrelevant, because it's not kal or piel. In Daniel 11, verse 40, it's the only instance in the Hebrew Bible of the hitpa'el of nagah. And in fact, it is the hitpa'el of nagah, followed by the preposition im. The hitpa'el is reflexive or reciprocal, but with im, hit nagah im, it means reciprocal action of one fighting against another from the get-go. There is nothing unilateral about this in the Hebrew. It is absolutely clear. It's a reciprocal fighting. Locking horns with each other is exactly what it would mean. You've seen pictures, maybe movie footage or on TV, whatever, of two horned animals, mountain goats or bulls, whatever, locking horns at mating season, to fight over who gets to, be the daddy, right? Okay, so they're locking horns with each other. This doesn't mean a unilateral knockout blow, boom, and he's gone for a long time, and then eventually, maybe he's going to recover, and maybe he's not. That's not the image that's here at all. And this is recognized by scholars. We have translations, we have lexicons that recognize this. At the time of the end, the king of the south will lock horns with him. That's NJPS, New Jewish Publication Society. Here is the page, not the page, but the entry from the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. Volume 2, page 667, on this verb, nagah. This is the whole entry on that verb. You can see up above, you have the kal, to gore, the piel, to toss and gore, or maybe stronger. This is all of the instances. You see the little kind of cross-shaped thing at the end of those lines? You see that? That means that's all the instances in the Hebrew Bible. And then we have the hitpa'el, H-I-T-P is hitpa'el. Imperfect, yitnagach, to join in combat with. Preposition im means to wage war. That is to wage war with. It's not a unilateral knockout blow. Daniel 11, verse 40, cross, meaning it's the only hitpa'el in the whole Hebrew Bible. Okay, so this is not a unilateral knockout blow. That is raw data from Hebrew language. There's no debate about it. It's not subject to interpretation. It's just raw data. It is not a unilateral knockout blow. Therefore, in interpretation, it cannot be unilateral infliction of a mortal wound on the papacy by atheistic France in 1798. That is not a historical fit. It doesn't work at all. There's no support here for atheism as the king of the South, and the atheism view requires this to be a knockout blow in Daniel 11, verse 40, in order to have the connection there with atheistic France inflicting the deadly wound, for this to be atheism, and that support is knocked out from that view definitively. Daniel 11, verse 40 means, therefore, in light of what we said, during the time of the end, not at the time of the end, not at 1798. The preposition bet, meaning during with expressions of time, is common. Dr. Yonker mentioned that. Here's an example. In, that is during the first year of Darius the Mede, in those times, in verse 6. And those are both from Daniel 11 itself. Here's another one, 1 Kings 11. During that time, 8, just the same kind of expression, but 8, right? That we have in Daniel 11, verse 40. Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, and during that time refers to what's happening in the previous verse, in verse 28. Okay, so relationship now to Daniel 11:35. Daniel 11:35 says, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. Ad 8 kates. Kates is literally cutting off. It refers to the end. For it still awaits the appointed time. This most naturally points to the period of the pre-Advent judgment, beginning in 1844, when God's loyal people are vindicated. It doesn't most naturally refer to 1798, the deadly wound infliction. This is the vindication of God's loyal people. This happens during the judgment that happens after 1798, beginning in 1844. Compare Daniel 8:17, the vision culminating in the justifying of the sanctuary in verse 14, referring to the end-time judgment beginning in 1844, is for the time of the end. So this is all during the time of the end. So 1135 points to the period of the time of the end, not just to its beginning in 1798. All right, conclusion. Raw data expose mistakes regarding Daniel 11. First, the literary genre is basically literal, never symbolic. Secondly, Cleopatra VII is not the daughter of women in verse 17. It's still Seleucids here, can't be Romans. And therefore, and then in fact, the same one who gives his daughter to her goes up in the next verse, verse 18, and he tries to conquer the coastlands, exactly what Antiochus III did. He went up to try to take Turkey and Greece, and a commander stops him in his tracks, turns his insolence back on him. That's the Roman commander he was defeated in 2 major battles by Romans at Thermopylae and Magnesia, which was definitive defeat. The Seleucids never recovered from that, and they had to pay crippling tribute. Antiochus IV, who became Antiochus Epiphanes, was taken as a hostage to Rome, and so on. And then the next verse, he, the same guy, Antiochus III, meets his end when, in fact, he was assassinated trying to plunder a temple in Elymais in his own territory to pay tribute to Rome. So it all fits down through verse 19 to be Seleucids. Tiberius is not the despicable one in verse 21. Verse 40 does not refer to the mortal wound of the papacy inflicted by atheistic France in 1798. In the name of progress, we need to move on and leave these mistakes behind so we do not waste any more time on them or interpretive arguments built on them. Because if an interpretive argument requires those violations of raw data, then that interpretive argument is wrong. Okay? Intratextual correspondences help to identify religious political papacy as the king of the north at the end of Daniel 11. The papacy defeats its archenemy, the king of the south, through military means, no doubt supplied by political allies in end-time alliance, see Babylon in Revelation. The king of the south should also be religious political. If the papacy is religious political, then who is its big enemy? Who has always been its big enemy? And you'll see secular writers writing about this. The nemesis, historically, of the papacy, of so-called Christendom, is the same power that it fought the Crusades against. And in fact, that power existentially threatened, I'm not making that up, I'm taking that from a book, existentially threatened Christendom, not once, but twice. Okay? And it's the one that has a religious stake in the literal land of Israel and Jerusalem, which the papacy wants to control. They fought over it before. The papacy lost, had to withdraw, but it's not over. It's going to come back. Previous conflict was such a southern power in Daniel 11, and it was a southern power. Yes, the supersession, it's not just Turkey, it's further to the north. The supersession in who takes over the power there, it's not the end-time Ottoman Empire, but it's a king of the north against a king of the south, as we saw during the Crusades. And it is still here more than ever. Both have over 1 billion adherents in the world today. Now, does that mean, because there's a possibility that there might be a literal fulfillment of that soon, do we want to then bracket that out because we shouldn't follow the news? Wait a minute, that's not Adventist approach. Ellen White tells us, Jesus tells us, look for the signs of the times, right? We should be aware. And, okay, if the king of the south is atheism or some other ideological ism, here's a challenge to that view. Where was atheism in Daniel 11, 25 to 30? What is the military power that represents atheism in 1140 to 43 after the time of revolutionary France, since 1798 is not in 1140? How would atheism control the Middle East until it initiates conflict with and is quickly defeated by the papacy? Here's what Ellen White says. Because some would want to shut our discussions down and would want to shut this view down, particularly because it's dangerous. It just might come true. You know, if we have an abstract interpretation that's abstract enough, we can't really see where the fulfillment is, and that's much safer. Yeah? That's really, and furthermore, you know, there's dangerous people in some of these groups out there. We've never worried that much about, recently, about the king of the north power, the papacy, and said, no, wait a minute, we shouldn't label that there in prophecy because we might offend some people and then they'll do bad things to us. We've never said that. My grandfather was a pastor evangelist in Australia, and when he was in Warwick in Queensland, and my father was a little boy in school in the same town, you know, evangelism in those days was not real, at least my grandfather, it wasn't real gospel-oriented. It was hard-hitting against the papacy. So my father was heckled and harassed with his sister, his older sister, on the way home from school. Kids yelling, Protestant dogs sitting on logs, eating maggots out of frogs. That's what they were yelling at them. Huh? And has the Adventist Church ever said, no, we have to change our prophetic interpretation because, you know, it might upset some people in that camp? Have we said that? Not recently. Maybe some have. Well, is it valid then to say the same thing about the king of the south if it turns out to be literal? Is that literal? Is that valid? And I would have to say, no, that would be cowardice. Are we to wait? I'm reading Ellen White. Are we to wait until the fulfillment of the prophecies of the end before we say anything concerning them? Of what value will our words be then? Shall we wait until God's judgments fall upon the transgressor before we tell him how to avoid them? Where is our faith in the word of God? Must we see things foretold come to pass before we will believe what he has said? In clear, distinct rays, light has come to us, showing us that the great day of the Lord is near at hand, even at the doors. Let us read and understand before it's too late. And to me, that's the bottom line. We see that everything is in place. We're in the beginning, we're living right now in the beginning part of verse 40. Everything is right there, poised, about to take place. We do not have much time left for finishing the gospel work, taking this gospel message. That's the point. It is not to put down anyone from any group. There are many, Jesus said in John 10, I have sheep which are not of this fold. And he probably has many, many more sheep in the folds of the king of the north and the king of the south than there are already in the fold. I mean, these are huge groups. And so these are precious people out there. And we're not talking against people individually. We're talking about systems that are opposed to God. We're not putting down one system or the other in terms of its people. I have friends, close friends, in both groups, the king of the north, the king of the south. Okay? I pray for them, and I want them to be saved. And look, I'm going to tell you really bluntly, right now, I do not like my interpretation of Daniel 11 in terms of coming to the identification of the king of the north or the king of the south. I do not like my interpretation. Okay? I'm forced to it by the exegesis. All right? I do not want the king of the south to be whom I've said it has to be. But if you have an alternative and you can do it and show me without violating the raw data, I'm all ears. I had big ones too. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. I apologize, folks, that sounds like a bit of an exegetical wrecking ball, but I believe that we have to eliminate some options before we move on. I tell my students when they want to know what is exegesis, I tell them, if you back me up against a wall and threaten me and said, Dr. Gane, tell me what exegesis is in 2 words. I'll give you 2 words to say what exegesis is. I'll say multiple choice. Multiple choice. Because what you're doing is you're looking for all the possible theoretical options and all the options that people have suggested, and you make a multiple choice exam. And then you go and you test it going against the biblical text, like the Bereans, that Paul talked about. You test it, and you take your own multiple choice test, and you narrow down the options. Narrowing down the options is a crucial part of exegesis, and that's what we're doing here today. All right, so I apologize if anyone's feelings are hurt, but I erred on the side of being clear, all right? And I'm interested in being clear. I'm not interested in hurting anyone's feelings, okay? Thank you. All right. That means that I did hurt your feelings, but you forgive me. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Gane. Our lunch is ready for us now. So we have plenty of time to ask Dr. Gane questions over our lunch. Can you guys hear me, by the way? Is this working? Is that working? Yeah, that's working. All right. So we won't take any questions from the floor right now, but we do have a couple of questions that have come in online. We have about 3 or 4 of them here. We'll take them quickly. Dr. Frank Hardy, you have a question for us?
Yes. One point for Dr. Yonker and one for Dr. Gane.
Can you hear them?
Not very well. Maybe I can pick it up here. Just a moment. Let's see if we can pull that in from here.
Wait a second.
Wait a second, Frank. Let me pull in sound here.
Dr. Gane is going to turn his sound on.
Okay, try that. Ooh,
Getting feedback. Can you hear?
this is not good. That's not working too well. Maybe if I get it away from this mic, let me get it over here. And let's.
All right, wait a second, Dr. Frank. All right, you can ask your question now.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, I think we're.
Turn your microphone off, though.
Okay, go ahead, try that.
Should I proceed? Is this okay?
Yeah, that's very
Okay,
good. Go ahead.
Okay, let's give this a try. Daniel 11:16. Dr. Yonker points out that Haba is normally used in a way that has an antecedent before it. And I won't disagree with anything he said along those lines. But the parallel with 926 is not just a parallel with 926. We have to take Daniel 11:16 and 17 together with 926 and 27 together. And when we do that, we get the following parallels. Haba elav, nagid haba, B'chala v'yado ba'ad kala, l'hashchita yashchit. Now, there were some extra words there. If we just pull out the parallel words, it's haba, haba, identical. Kala, kala, identical. L'hashchita yashchit, almost identical. The one is an infinitive, the other is a finite form, but both are built on yashchit, on shachat, and both represent the Hifil conjugation of that root. So I return to your point about archaeology. If three holes line up, you start to wonder if Mother Nature did that by herself. And when I see this quantity and quality of verbal parallels, I'm thinking the angel is trying to tell us something. He's trying to direct our attention back to chapter 9. And the antecedent there is not Greece. Then should we pause there if Dr. Jonker wants to respond?
No, let's just carry on. Ask your question of Dr. Gane.
Okay, all right. Then another comment. In regard to Daniel 11, verse 40, no argument with almost anything you've said, just one point. It is true that Yet Nagach represents the Hit-Pael conjugation, and that this is different from PL and from Kal. And so there are those differences, I grant that. And yet, there's something uneven about this. This is a second example in the same verse where the Hebrew doesn't really parse, because the preposition im connotes two people, and yet the verb yet nagah is not yet nagahu, it's not plural, it is singular. And so I'm a little puzzled by your remark that this cannot be, on the basis of the Hebrew, that this cannot be unilateral. Singular, to me, sounds like unilateral.
Maybe I'll come here to answer that. All right, can you all hear me now? Can you hear me, Frank?
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Yeah, Yitnagach Yitnagach is singular because it's referring to one party that is initiating, that is provoking the other party. Maybe I need to turn my sound off here. Okay. All right. Problem solved, I think. Okay, so Yitnagach joins with him. Okay, so the first he, who's the subject of the verb, is and the antagonist of the pronominal suffix on im. So you have two parties here. One of them initiates it. Okay, it's not a knockout blow though, because he just starts the process, and then the other one is right away locking with his horns with him. It is not then knocking one down so that he's down and out for a long period of time, like centuries, like the papacy was before the healing of the deadly wound. That's simply not the event that it's describing.
All right, any further comeback on that, Dr. Hardy? No, we're not hearing anything there. So we have a couple of other questions have come in. Those, I just read them out here. One is from Jesse Ravencroft, who I believe has published a book on this topic. He says, do any other Hebrew scholars agree with Dr. Gane on the point of locking horns being a mutual fight and not a unilateral attack?
Okay, you can go ahead.
All right, okay. A question from Tom Proudfoot. Does Dr. Gane believe verse 40 could be describing an event such as 9/11?
No.
Well,
no, it can't. It's not. 9/11 was an act of provocation that's kind of leading up to things. But we did have that initial kind of going in. We took Afghanistan and all the rest of it, right? All right. So, but that didn't continue through. What we see, the narrative going on, the prophetic narrative, is that it is one stream of action going in, taking over the whole Middle East, and then it leads right up to the eschaton. That is, right up to the close of probation, the time of trouble, and all the rest of it. So what we've seen is a warning shot across the bow. Yeah. That much bigger things are going to be coming in the future. Now, if you think that this is not theoretically possible, think again. In Jerusalem, where I lived for 2 years as a student at the Hebrew University, I have visited, and I know some of the rest have visited, a little museum that's in the old city where they're making the temple furniture. You can see they have the menorah built already, the lamp, for making a third temple. And where is it going to be? Where that Dome of the Rock is, right? That's where it needs to be. And already there have been threats of trying to blow up Al-Aqsa Mosque years ago. There was a guy who tried to firebomb it just before I got there in 1978. And so, look, if anything happens that those who really want, including the futurist dispensationalists, they think there's going to be a third temple, okay? And futurist dispensationalism really influences American politics a lot. Certainly did during the George W. Bush era. So if anything happens that gets blown up, there will be an instant jihad that will unite the whole Islamic world, and then they'll rush and try to take over Israel. And then what would we do? What would the United States do? Have to defend Israel. And to do that, what would we do? We'd pass into the glorious land, and then we'd go in and attack all the forces. So the whole thing is very, very plausible. Now, the fact that it's plausible that way, and that we shouldn't reconstruct and say this is the way it's going to be. We can say things are in place that it could go that way at any time. And I think that's the important thing, that these things can happen very fast, and we need to really get on the ball. And as Ellen White would say, get the work finished. But what we shouldn't do is to too closely look at the newspaper and say, aha, this is this, and therefore, it's a little bit of a broader perspective in terms of looking at the trajectory of events. A lot of people thought that the end was coming right at 9/11. Well, it sort of didn't happen quite that way, but what we are seeing is warnings that it's coming. And when it comes, it's going to be a whole lot bigger than anything we've ever seen before.
All right, Dr. Gane.
I got to quit.
Yeah. Two more quick questions here. One from Pastor John Whitcomb, who's joining us. He said, is it true that we're inserting an assumption into our interpretation when we say that the Roman rulers are the kings of the north, seeing the text does not directly state this? Is it an assumption in our interpretation that the Roman rulers are kings of the north?
Is it an assumption that Roman rulers are kings of the north?
And I think he must be talking about imperial Rome here, Augustus or Tiberius, rather than Roman rule. I don't think he's referring to the papacy here. I think he's referring to pagan Rome. Yeah,
okay. Well, as I didn't have the opportunity to trace as much in this as I have in some of my previous things, like my article Methodology for Interpretation of Daniel 11:2 to 12:3, which got published in the Journal of Adventist Theological Society and published as a little book, Understanding Daniel, that passage, Daniel 11, in 7 steps, published by the Inter-American Division, translated into Spanish. And there I trace things more historically, but you can see a historical succession. We're not assuming anything. We don't want to assume anything, because what happens, Antiochus III, his kingdom, there were more Seleucid rulers after that, but it got swallowed up along with the Greek kingdoms, got swallowed up by the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire took over from Antiochus III and took over the so-called Holy Land, the glorious land, the land of Israel, took over from him. So it is a political succession, one after the other. We're not assuming anything. That was the Roman Republic, which became the Imperial Rome, which then was superseded by Papal Rome. It's an organic continuity, and we're not assuming anything.
All right, and a final question. This is from Jesse Ravencroft. He says, there's quite a few questions here, but he says, I'm not aware that the text directly implies via exegesis that the king of the north in verses 5 through 15 is Seleucid Syria. Don't we come to that conclusion entirely from placing history on the text and not from exegeting the text per se? Now, that's a great question, because everybody I've read on this, Daniel 11, always has the Seleucids from verse 5 onwards, the Antiochus fighting the Ptolemies and so forth, and kind of everybody kind of agrees to that, and he's asking a very fundamental question, which is, aren't we just imposing history on the text? and it's safe to do so because it's 2,500 years ago? Or what in the text, what exegesis brings us to that conclusion?
Okay, good question. Now, of course, the most radical interpretation of Daniel 11 that I have seen is that of Dr. Jacques Ducan in his book on Daniel 11, in which he simply skips all the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and skips, in fact, he sort of I've heard him, I've seen him in a presentation in a church where he's made fun of that idea. So he's really opposed to that idea. And he skips right from to the papacy right away at the beginning there. But if you read the text, it says that the mighty king, who everyone agrees is Alexander the Great, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven. We see that in Daniel 8, right? Toward the four winds are the four directions. And then it says, in verse 5, then the king of the south. We've just referred to four directions. And now it says the king of the south, one of those directions, shall be strong, but one of his princes stronger than he. And then in the next verse, after some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north, another one of those directions. And then in verse 8, it tells us that the king of the south, it makes it clear that that is Egypt. Okay, so if Egypt is the southern territory, and then it's a power that can fight against it next to it from the north, and later on we see it's fighting over the land of Israel, there's nothing else it could be than Seleucid Syria. So all we're doing is tracing the indicators in the text. There's no assumption here whatsoever. And then the history, Dr. Yonker and I taught a class years ago, an interdisciplinary doctoral seminar. He was doing the history and I was doing the text, and we were looking at the text profile and looking at how it fit the history. The correspondence is remarkable down through verse 19. We have to agree with the preterists. They're right about that. It fits all the way down through Antiochus III.
All right, so we have a bunch of other questions
That's
here.
not just imposing history on the text. What you have to do is you look at the text profile, and then you see who fits. If the hat fits, wear it. It's the text first. The text always takes priority. History is always secondary. And that's why we look so carefully at Daniel 11, verse 40 now, to see what the text is actually saying, to see what history fits, and the other cases as well. And that's what we do with the king of the north, king of the south, Seleucids, and Ptolemies.
So it's time for us to break for our lunch. I agree with you on the interpretation of those verses being the Seleucids, but it seems to me, in all fairness, that if we apply the text to today's history, then when everybody says, oh, you're interpreting it through the newspapers. But because this is 2,500 years ago, it's safe to do that. We can say we can just put the text, overlay the history on the text, and say it's a good match.
That is an allegation, and I don't accept that allegation. I'm an exegete, and as I said, I don't like my interpretation. I'm looking at the text, and if it matches with history, it matches. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And so it's not just a matter of looking at newspapers today and then saying, oh, this has got to be this, because that's the way it used to operate. And I really resonate with something Pastor LeBrun said, and that was at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which is about officially, finally about 1920 or so, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Then Adventist interpreters, we didn't really have scholars in terms of exegetes in those days, but Adventist interpreters dropped the Uriah Smith interpretation of Turkey being the king of the north like a hot potato. And they went to a spiritual interpretation, the atheism view that's come about now. That's not really a valid reason for dropping or picking up an interpretation, is what happens in the news. Yes?
I was going to say that Persia and Greece are explicit mentioned in the text.
Correct.
So that whole Seleucid thing is coming right out of the word Greece. So if you're going to take Greece as historical literal, then it's divided before. There's no room for doubt on that historically. There's absolutely no